Hi, this is Becky Alvin of Software AG. I'd like to take a few minutes today to talk to you about Adabas Encryption for ZOS. If you're listening to me today, you've probably been using Adabas for decades now. And in your Adabas environment, you probably have lots of sensitive data. That sensitive data can be personal information, your name, your address, social security numbers. It can be health information. It could be financial information, bank account numbers, credit card numbers, whatever. It could be something that you wouldn't even think of as being that sensitive, like a customer list. Your competitors would always like to get a look at your customer list. So that kind of thing should be considered sensitive. And because you have all this sensitive data, there are probably discussions going on within your organization about how to protect the sensitive data. So yeah, you're going to have your normal security, right, in your mainframe world, your ZOS world, using RACF, ACF2, or top secret. We'll talk about that in a second. But you're also going to have to think about how to better protect the data itself, where it resides, which is the data at rest. And that's what Adabas Encryption for ZOS does. It allows you to encrypt the data sets that make up an Adabas database. And those are the associated data and so on. We'll talk about that later. Now, in addition to encrypting the data at rest, which is our product code AEZ, Adabas Encryption for ZOS, there's also the capability to encrypt the data in flight. And the data in flight is when an application sends a record to Adabas or Adabas sends a record back to the application. That's considered in flight. And if you want to encrypt that data in flight, that's done with our entire network product code WCP. Now, depending upon what your company or your organization or your agency does, there's probably different regulations, rules, compliance mandates, whatever you want to call it, about encrypting data. And more and more and more of my customers are coming to me saying, yeah, I've got to encrypt my data because I have to meet a HIPAA requirement, which is health information, Sarbanes-Oxley for publicly traded companies, PCI for personal credit information, GDPR, which is the European Union data protection regulations, which are also being used here in the US. So there's a lot of different people that are coming after you saying you have to not only secure who has access to the data, but you have to encrypt the data at rest. And one of the key things to note here is that we, Software AG, did not write our own encryption mechanisms. We are relying on IBM's pervasive encryption, which has been around for a number of years. It's tried, it's true, it's proven to work. And we rely on them to do the encryption and the decryption and to do the encryption key management for us, okay? And another key point here, so there's two. One is we're using IBM's pervasive encryption to do the encryption and the encryption key management. The second bullet point that you need to remember is there are zero changes required to any Adabas application, whether that Adabas application is a natural program, a COBOL program, issuing direct calls to Adabas, a SQL program, whatever it is, zero changes. It's completely transparent to the applications. And one of the main reasons why we chose to use IBM's pervasive encryption is that it does not take a lot of overhead to run that, right? It's been around for a number of years, especially with the newer mainframes. The encryption is becoming even more and more efficient. I want to take a second here to talk about a couple of things that have been available to you, the Adabas customer, for a number of years, in some cases decades here. You should already be doing Adabas access control via RACF, ACF2, or top secret. Those are the three mainframe ZOS security packages, right? And Adabas, through its AdaSAF module, AdaSAF is the Adabas Security Access Facility. That AdaSAF allows you to interface Adabas to RACF or whatever, And within there, you could define who can get to a database or a file, and then what can they do on a particular file. Do I have update capabilities on just a couple of files, and I can read a lot of other files, and there's probably some files I don't even have access to as a user, right? That's what the access control is all about, is who can get to a database, can they get to a file? If so, can they read or can they update? That's access control. Everybody should be doing this. Another thing that's been available for a long time, and a good percentage of my customers do use the disk level encryption. Disk level is completely different than IBM's pervasive data set level. Disk level protects the disk hardware, and it is provided by the hardware storage provider, whether it's IBM, Hitachi, EMC, whoever it is. It's basically just protecting the disk. If that disk gets stolen, but what's the odds of that, right? It's probably way less than 10% of all data breaches are from somebody stealing a disk. But that's really all it protects for. Is if that disk is removed, either stolen, removed by the hardware vendor, shipped out by you, the customer, to the hardware vendor because it's got a problem, whatever. It does not prevent any unauthorized users from getting to what's actually on the disk itself. There's no security checks involved here. That's where the next two bullet points come in. The first is what I'm going to talk about, which is Adabas Encryption for ZOS. Okay, this does provide some of the things that you don't get with the disk level, the hardware level encryption. So putting Adabas data sets, encrypting those under IBM's pervasive encryption in conjunction with some RACF or top secret or ACF2, it does allow you to control what happens with that data in the mainframe environment, right? As long as that encrypted data, as long as that encryption key doesn't follow that data, then it's still secured. It will prevent people from moving production data into a non-secured environment unless they have the key. And the encryption keys are very rare. Who actually knows what the encryption keys are and can access those? That's usually not even done by a DBA, certainly not by an application programmer. There's usually a security group within your organization. So the data set encryption provided by Adabas Encryption for ZOS using IBM's pervasive encryption in conjunction with the Adabas access control provided by AdaSAF to RACF, those in combination create a very secured environment for your sensitive data. The last bullet point here is another newer offering from Software AG. It came out earlier in 2021. It's called Adabas Auditing. It allows you to audit suspicious activity or go back and look in case you think something happened. It could be from an actual valid user. I've had this happen at some of my customers. I've actually had to testify in court before. A valid user would go in and modify records that they shouldn't have been doing. And what we had to do was go back and look through tons of protection logs. And you guys know reading protection logs, not easy. And that's what this Adabas auditing will allow you to do. There's a separate presentation recorded that'll introduce you to this, or you can call me or anybody at Software AG and we can talk to you about this. But it will allow you to monitor after the fact, or possibly real time if you want it, any kind of suspicious activity. Okay, I'm not going to spend much time on there. I'm going to talk to you about encryption. So as I've mentioned for the umpteenth time, Adabas Encryption for ZOS, it allows you to protect your sensitive data by encrypting those data sets that make up the Adabas database, right? And then we're going to rely on IBM's pervasive encryption, which is what's really talked about on this slide here, to do all the encryption, all of the encryption key management of that encrypted database. And these are just some of the components that make up IBM's pervasive encryption. And I'm not going to talk to you about pervasive encryption on that because that's an IBM thing. If you need more information, contact me or somebody at Software AG, and we will tell you how Adabas interfaces to this. But one of the key things is to know is that in particular with the Z15 mainframe, there is that new encryption processor that can be enabled, and that is what really makes pervasive encryption, therefore Adabas encryption, extremely fast and efficient and not cause a lot of CPU overhead. So this slide here is just going to kind of introduce you to the concepts of how Adabas encryption works in conjunction with IBM's pervasive encryption. So if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, you'll see Adabas sitting here in this big green box kind of in the middle left-hand side. So that's Adabas as we know it. It's a started task running on the mainframe. If you get Adabas encryption for ZOS, there's a new load module, load library that goes with it. There's a license key. And then that is the piece that will communicate to IBM's pervasive encryption. So you're going to encrypt your data sets that make up your Adabas database. Anything that you want to encrypt on, if you got one database, encrypt that one. If you got 10 databases you want to encrypt, you'll encrypt each 10 separately. But what it is you're encrypting the data sets that make up that database. As we all know, the data storage data set is the raw data. The associator data set is the index structures that might contain sensitive information to help find those records in data storage much quicker. There's the work data set where on work part 1, we're storing before and after images of all the changes. You've got the plog data set, which is the more long-term recovery data set that has before and after images of all the change data. You also have command logs, temp, and sort data sets. My recommendation is to encrypt all of the data sets associated with any particular database that you want to encrypt. So you go ahead and you encrypt it, and the encryption key will be maintained by IBM's pervasive encryption under this enterprise key management piece. So as an application, whether that application is on the mainframe or it's coming in from a remote device, that call to Adabas comes in, and let's say you're requesting to read a particular record. You want the Becky Albin record. So Adabas will determine where that record is. It will issue the read IO. So that's where Adabas encryption for ZOS comes in. It's an enhancement to our Ada IOR, our IO routines. It will issue the read IO. IBM's iOS, that's for input-output system. It will grab our read request. It will then go out, get the appropriate key, verify that, through RACF, that this is an encrypted database, a data set, all that kind of stuff. It will then issue the IO over to associator data, whatever we need to IO. It will decrypt that data, pass that information back to Adabas. Adabas will get that record, that Becky Albin record, and pass it back to the application. Same thing happens for an update. Let's say that I move from Reston, Virginia to, I don't know, New York City. Don't think it'll ever happen, but maybe. So I will, my application will come in with an update for the Becky Albin record. Adabas will process that. It will then want to write that Becky Albin record out to disk, so it issues an IO to update the record. It'll pass it through the IO system. IBM's pervasive encryption will say, yep. They'll encrypt that data. They'll update the associator appropriately as Adabas told it to, and the data storage area and the work and the P-logs and all that other stuff. As we do those IOs, IBM handles all the encryption and decryption. Really, nothing changes other than every time an IO is issued, it's intercepted by IBM's pervasive encryption to encrypt or decrypt. That's really the big difference. Okay. Now, if you're going to implement encryption, a couple of things to know about. First of all, you have to be on IBM 3390 devices. Doesn't mean you can't use IBM pseudo device types like Ada run device equals 8393, perfectly fine, because under the covers, that's a 3390. Your database data sets have to be SMS managed, system managed storage, right? About half of my customers do, half don't. If you're not using SMS storage on your database data sets, you're going to have to do that as step one. Get everything under SMS control. Then you're going to take those data sets and you're going to allocate some new data sets. You're going to format them, and there's some stuff you have to do during that to actually say that you're encrypting these data sets. And then you basically do a backup of your old unencrypted database, restore it into these new data sets that are encrypted, and boom, you're ready to go. That's at a high level. Tell you how this all works. The one thing I want to talk about here on the left-hand side is this shows different data sets, and some are blue and some are this kind of green color. What this is representing is that you could actually, within the database, encrypt some of the files and not encrypt some of the files. My personal recommendation is encrypt the entire database, all the files, all the data sets that make up that database. Because if not, you have to have a data R1 and an associator R1 for the unencrypted files, and you have to have a data R2 and an associator R2 or R3, R4, R5, whatever it is. You have to have another data set or data sets that will handle the encrypted files. And I just think that that's asking for the DBAs to kind of have too many things going on, because you have to worry about unused space in the encrypted or the unencrypted area, and an encrypted file can't take space on a data set that's allocated for unencrypted and vice versa. So my personal recommendation is just encrypt the entire database, all the files on it, all the data sets. But if you wanted to, you can split them up. I can talk to you more about that later. But once you have it set up and running, it's really transparent to the applications. It's not that much overhead for the DBAs, especially if you encrypt everything. Just to kind of wrap up here, to use Adabas Encryption for ZOS, you have to be on a Z13, 14, or 15. Both Software AG and IBM will recommend the 15s because you're just going to get better performance there. You have to be at ZOS 2.3 or 2.4. And if you're at those levels, you have to have an APAR called OA56622 applied, because that's how IBM introduced large data sets, which is what IBM's data, or what Software AG's database database data sets, it's hard to say, database data sets are. So that will allow database data sets to work with IBM's pervasive encryption. You have to be at Adabas 8.4.3 or above. You have to have ADASAP 8.2 or 8.5, and you have to get a license for Adabas Encryption for ZOS, which will give you the license key and the load library you need, and that is at version 8.5. That will work with Adabas 8.4 or 8.5. You're fine. And then if you want to also encrypt the data in flight between Adabas and the applications, that's done with Entire Network 6.5.1 or 6.5.2.